Due to technical difficulty, I'll begin that again for the record there. There is some irony in having a hearing on technology integration when the button didn't work on the back side over here.
You can see it.
We can't see it. This room has been in operation, I believe, since about 1937, so there are parts of the federal government that are somewhat lagging behind the current level of data communications. Welcome to the most recent installment in this subcommittee's ongoing efforts to promote the standardization of program data within and across public benefit programs. One of the key purposes for today's hearing will be to review the progress that has already been made with relevant agencies and outside experts, as well as consider next steps. It was just 13 months ago that this subcommittee held its first hearing on the use of data matching to improve customer service, program integrity, and taxpayer savings. One of the initial factors driving this effort was the rising level of federal improper payments, which peaked at $125 billion in FY 2010. But it was about much more than that. It really became about making government work smarter, faster, and more efficiently for both beneficiaries and taxpayers. We should expect more from government. We should expect it not to operate from an era before the personal computer existed, but one from the 21st century, using integrated technologies and information systems, not unlike the private sector uses today in competitive industry, and also most consumers do within their homes today in terms of how they manage their finances and their purchases. Companies like Google and Facebook have grown based on their ability to help customers search, access, share, and interpret data. It's long past time for government to use those same sorts of tools to improve the services we offer to help the less fortunate and the taxpayer dollars spent on them. In September, the President signed our bipartisan, bicameral Child and Family Services Improvement and Innovation Act, which codified into law for the first time in history our data standards language for all child welfare programs. This was followed by another example of bipartisanship when the same language was included in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 and applied to the unemployment insurance and the temporary assistance to needy families programs. We hope to expand this effort through H.R. 4282, which was recently introduced by Representative Berg and Ranking Member Doggett and co-sponsored by the entire subcommittee. This bill would apply the same data standardization language to the Child Support Enforcement Program under our jurisdiction. With enactment in 3 programs already, Congress has sent a clear bipartisan message that it wants to improve the operation of public benefit programs through data standardization. H.R. 3339, the Standard Data Act, would apply this provision more broadly to all programs within the subcommittee's jurisdiction. We believe this bill is firm but flexible so that those with the most knowledge of how these programs operate can come together to craft a better path forward. But we also need to hold the executive branch accountable for its role in modernizing the operation of government programs. That's why we've asked several key agencies, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security, to testify at this hearing about their progress and plans for the future. We plan to continue to expand this effort across other programs that serve similar populations so we can achieve a truly beneficiary-centered approach to how these programs are run. We also need a more complete view of how many people receive benefits under multiple programs, which will help to better target benefits to people in need, as well as improve understanding of program effectiveness. Especially given our budget challenges ahead, we simply have no choice but to take these steps to make sure programs operate more efficiently and provide benefits to those most in need and only to those in need. We look forward to all testimony from both of our panels. We also look forward to continuing to work in a bipartisan manner to improve how public benefit programs serve the children and families who depend on them while ensuring taxpayer dollars are used efficiently and effectively. Now I'd like to turn the microphone over to my friend and partner in this effort over the last year and a half, the ranking member, Lloyd Doggett from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the great personal interest that you've shown in this whole data matching effort and for the partnership we have enjoyed in working, as you mentioned, on child welfare legislation, on data matching and for temporary assistance for needy families, and for unemployment insurance programs. It is important to improve the administration of public programs through technology. It benefits taxpayers and it benefits those who rely on those programs. Abuse of government programs, whether by a multinational pharmaceutical company or a person collecting unemployment insurance, is never acceptable. It denies the benefits that are needed to others, and it unjustly treats the taxpayer. I hope we can continue to make progress on standardizing data, that would include incorporating existing non-proprietary standards such as XBRL that has the support of the Texas Society of Certified Public Accountants. I think that better use of data matching and data sharing across agencies improves our efforts to reduce fraud and abuse. We want to get these benefits to those who need them and who are eligible for them. And my interest in this is not only about program integrity, but in seeing that programs satisfy their legislated purpose. This is particularly true when there are so many families in my home state of Texas and across the country that struggle to maintain their footing. In Bexar County, for example, 1 in 4 children are poor. We must find a way to ensure that our most vulnerable citizens are provided with the assistance that they need to weather economic storms and improve the ability to do this. Improving the ability to do this through better data is one important aspect of outreach. Those efforts are now underway in Philadelphia through a collaboration between the state of Pennsylvania and the Benefits Data Trust, a nonprofit organization from whom we will hear this morning. The Benefit Data Trust has been able to use state data to determine if an individual who is receiving assistance from a certain program is likely eligible for assistance in another. It is true that there are too many duplicative programs, but the total benefits provided by all of them, if delivered efficiently in the most effective way, probably do not begin to meet the needs that are out there. Identifying and connecting low-income individuals to the services for which they are eligible allows the organization to work in a cost-efficient manner while also dramatically improving the outcomes of those individuals who are to receive benefits and our economy in the process. I think this is particularly relevant to the current attention on the delivery of food assistance through the SNAP program. A report released recently by the Department of Agriculture found that SNAP benefits help to reduce national poverty in a significant way. These benefits play an important role in providing critical assistance that I saw recently at the food bank in the west side of San Antonio. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses and continuing our work together to improve the outreach, the efficiency, and the effectiveness of these vital public initiatives through the use of technology. Thank you so much.
I thank the gentleman. I want to remind our witnesses to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, please. However, without objection, all of the written testimony be made part of the permanent record. Our first panel this morning will be hearing from Ms. Donna Roy, the Executive Director of the National Information Exchange Model, or NIEM, from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and also the Honorable George Sheldon, the Assistant Secretary for the Administration for Children and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and we happen to stand together behind President Obama as he signed into law that very first piece of data standardization language on September 30th of last year. So we're excited to have you here. Before we move on to our testimony, without objection, I would like to change pace for one moment and recognize Dr. Price, Chairman of the Republican Policy Committee, who's a member of the subcommittee and able to be here with us today, who'd like to introduce a witness from his home state who will speak on our second panel today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for going out of order, and I appreciate the indulgence of the chair, but I wanted to take this opportunity, not knowing the schedule that was going to break as the morning proceeds, to introduce Daryl McDonald, who's going to be on our second panel. Daryl, in the back there, is Executive Vice President of Teradata, a wonderful corporate citizen and job creator in Georgia and in my district. Teradata is responsible for providing strategic direction for their products, solutions, and services, and is among the world's largest companies focused solely on analytics and data warehousing. Teradata is a growing business with over 8,000 employees worldwide. Mr. McDonald has deep roots in Georgia, having attended the University of Georgia, and can give a good go dogs with the best of them. He currently lives in the 6th Congressional District, and his testimony on the second panel today will highlight how both business and government can benefit from technology and ultimately save the taxpayers' money. So I'm pleased and honored to introduce and welcome Daryl McDonald to our committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And with that, Ms. Roy, please proceed with your testimony.
Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee, thank you and good morning. My name is Donna Roy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Information Sharing Environment Office in the Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Chief Information Officer. I also serve as the Executive Director of the National Information Exchange Program, or the NIEM program. I have had the privilege of holding this position for the past 3.5 years. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you today how NEAM helps government agencies enhance mission performance, gain efficiencies, and reduce costs associated with exchanging information across IT systems. NEAM is a federally supported government-wide initiative that helps communities of people with common interests connect and exchange information in order to successfully and efficiently accomplish their missions. NEAM is not a system or a database, nor does it transmit, store, or engage in operational data storing. Rather, NEAM provides the tools, the training, and importantly, the community-driven support to assist users in adopting a standards-based approach. It is fitting that we are having this discussion today on the 7th birthday of the NEAM program. The program began on April 19th in 2005 when the CIOs of DOJ and DHS signed an agreement to establish the interagency program. This action brought to fruition the work started by a half a dozen or so practitioners at the state and local level of government who had worked to build a national model for sharing law enforcement and homeland security information. Today, all 50 states and 18 federal agencies are committed to using NEAM in some capacity and at varying levels of maturity. NEAM is now recognized and used by international partners such as Canada, Mexico, and member countries of the European Union. Despite NEAM's growth over this past 7 years, the program has maintained at its core a strong commitment to community involvement. In my opinion, this is one of the main reasons why NEAM stands apart as an example of a government collaboration at its best. Whether NEAM is involved in a situation to protect citizens, respond to disasters, promote public health, or provide needed support services to children and their families, the lack of standardization and information exchange across this broad landscape of systems, agencies, and jurisdictions creates challenges in providing effective and efficient citizen services, often leading to fraud, waste, and abuse. The challenge is clear. How do we connect the wide array of systems across the whole of government while supporting an appropriate privacy and security framework flexible enough to accommodate the diverse laws, regulations, and policies across the United States? So the majority of the work within NEAM is accomplished within a strong and active community of volunteers at the state and local level. The NEAM community stewards a common vocabulary and a mature framework to facilitate information exchange. NEAM breaks down agency stovepipes and creates opportunities for agencies to share information quickly and effectively without rebuilding systems. As an example of success, NEAM has helped the state of Colorado connect child support systems with judicial processing systems, improving the speed of administrative case processing and the execution of child support orders. The project reduced manual data entry, eliminated most of the paper forms, improved data reliability. In effect, NEAM helps Colorado provide faster, cheaper, and better services to its citizens. In the difficult fiscal times facing the government today, it is core systematic improvements that will save scarce financial resources, improving the effectiveness of government and ultimately making our country safer. NEAM is one of these rare systematic improvement opportunities. As a former Marine who possesses a sincere passion for good government, I'm continually impressed and energized by the level of support across the NEAM community. On a more personal note, as the daughter of a woman who aged out of the system and as a former foster mom, I'm particularly touched by the positive changes NEAM is making in the lives of the most vulnerable children, the vulnerable in our society, which is the children and the families that support them. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Roy, and we wish you a happy birthday to NEAM as well. The Chair now recognizes Secretary Sheldon for your testimony.
Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Doggett, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the development of standardized data exchanges and the use of technology to better target benefits and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. This is my second opportunity to testify in front of this committee. I testified 2 years ago as Secretary of the Department of Children and Families in Florida on this committee's efforts to provide expansion of the 4E waiver concept, and I thank you for the legislation that passed this year. I would like to begin by acknowledging the leadership of Chairman Davis in this area. Like you, I believe that these efforts will lead to better targeting of benefits to eligible households and at the same time will reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. Much work is occurring in this regard already, but clearly much more needs to be done, and the hearing today furthers this critical conversation. I have a deep personal commitment to the effort you are promoting because I experienced firsthand as a state administrator what a difference improved data sharing can make for those in the front line of delivering services. We all recognize the problem that we're trying to tackle. Valuable information which could support more accurate eligibility and benefit determinations and more thoughtful case planning is siloed among multiple systems across related but not fully integrated programs. Even in cases in which organizations are allowed to share information, uncertainties about legal requirements, cultural differences, and misperceptions about privacy requirements too often stymie efforts to exchange information even when the benefits are obvious. We face this situation in the state of Florida, for instance. And the first point I would like to emphasize that the solution is not purely a technical one, that the initial hurdle is to promote a new way of thinking, a cultural exchange that promotes the sharing of information. In Florida, we worked across 8 state agencies to develop what we called a Children and Youth Cabinet Information Sharing System. But rather than develop the initiative from start, we piggybacked on the success of another initiative that the court system had had in place for some 6 years. The court system was a multi-agency data sharing system. In this manner, they were not only benefited from technology platforms, but we were also able to incorporate the lessons that they had learned. I emphasize our use of the piggyback in Florida because we're taking that same approach at ACF. I'll talk more about NEAM later, but as you know, we know a good idea when we see it. It does not make sense to pay for a duplicate system we already own and invested in heavily. I believe that the committee's initial emphasis on data exchange is wise. While I'm not discounting the need for investment to support systems at the federal, state, and local levels, there are significant returns that we can realize by improving data sharing within the systems that we currently have. Implementing our system in Florida was a big step forward. It saved time, saved labor, it reduced errors, and it provided real-time access to information. And it allowed participating agencies to maintain the control and security that they wanted over their own data. This is another point I want to emphasize because it demonstrates that significant gains can be made without compromising privacy, which I know is a critical concern of everyone in this room. And most importantly, it supports better decision-making because it provides much-needed, real-time, up-to-date data and data exchange capability on a vulnerable child or a vulnerable family. My experience also confirms that improved data sharing can lead to lower improper payments. In Florida, we determined eligibility for TANF, the SNAP program, Medicaid, and refugee payments through an integrated, automated process. And while we had some 5 years ago been one of the worst food stamp error rates in the country, in the last 3 years of my tenure there, we achieved the lowest error rate in the SNAP program for 3 consecutive years, an unprecedented achievement. By 2010, the error rate was under 1%. The point I'm making is that an appropriate use of technology in terms of combining our data elements can really lead to an overall improvement of the system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to move on to questions now. You know, what we're talking about today is not new data, but using existing data, existing information more efficiently and effectively. Secretary Sheldon, nearly every one of your programs provides a congressional or an annual report, most of which come to this committee. And I have 2 here, which I will not enter into the record out of mercy for the transcriptionist, where we've got some examples that I would like to show you. We've got pages up on the screen right now, pages of quite detailed information, such as how many beneficiaries there are and how dollars are being spent. However, beyond those broad facts, the data is not usable or usable in helping to improve how the programs perform. Variance metrics, understanding the quality of work, the ability to drill down inside of those. And for example, what I'd like to share with you and our members on the subcommittee from these pages, a recent Child Welfare Annual Report on states' planned and actual expenditures, which was requested by Congress. I see that many of the same forms are used throughout, but one thing that jumps out is how overall the data lacks consistency. The pages also appear to be PDF copies of the original forms submitted in paper form by states, making many of them illegible, frankly. What does your agency do with this information, and do you think this sort of report is useful for your staff, congressional staff, or outside experts? And I want to qualify my remark. I'm not doing this to put you on the spot so much, but as we've discussed, we have this common problem we're trying to work around, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on steps to fix this.
I appreciate this. This reporting is based on congressional authorization of how we should be displaying this information. I do think this data is important not only to us, but I think it is important to the field. But clearly, as you've identified, these PDF files are not very user-friendly. And so Brian Samuels, who's our Commissioner for the Administration for Children, Youth, and Family, actually identified this difficulty about a year ago and began working with his staff to try to get a more uniform system of reporting from the states. In addition to that, it is my view that at some point, assuming resources are available, we need to be moving from this kind of a PDF form to a much more user-friendly, state-friendly, and services-friendly system than I think this really represents. It is something that's been identified, and I appreciate you bringing it to my personal attention, but I would report that Commissioner Samuels has identified this and is attempting to work on it.
Yeah, I believe the purpose of the report is to understand state variations in planned and actual expenditures on child welfare so policy can know what works better to protect children. And that's an important goal. How do you expect this and other reports will change with the enactment of our data standards provision that was signed into law?
I think the data standardization exchanges are an excellent opportunity to begin addressing some of these issues. As I indicated in my prepared comments, a lot of progress has been made, but there is still a lot more that needs to be done, and I think this is one good example of an element that I think what we're doing with NEAM, we've established an interoperability project management team headed by Joe Bodmer, who's behind me. I'm very optimistic about the direction that they're taking and the impact it could have on these kinds of reports.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ms. Roy, NEAM is not a standard, but a way of setting parameters for data exchange so information can flow more freely. I recognize this pushes beyond NEAM, but can you tell us more about the burden on the agencies and departments, especially small local governments, to transition to the structures developed by NEAM, both in the short and long term? And feel free to use examples outside of human services if that'd be helpful in answering the question.
Thank you for asking that question, Chairman. We believe we hold true in the NEAM program. One basic foundational tenet is that we provide technologies and tools and support to reduce the burden for our state and local adopters, to make sure that the technology we employ is consumable given the reduced budgets and the strains that they have at the state and local level. As an example, in this PDF, it would be as simple as putting XML behind and embedded within this PDF that would make this a usable document, that would provide a very low burden to implement this type of solution. So the Recovery Act included recipient reporting from the state and locals in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. In the back of that Excel spreadsheet were XML data that could be used to exchange information and to add up and total up the dollars there. So I don't believe that everything that we do is a high cost IT implementation within the state and locals. We really reduce that burden by providing tools and ways for them to use XML in a manner that is at a reduced cost and a quicker time for implementation.
Very good. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to yield to Mr. Doggett, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Ms. Roy, the NEAM, as it currently exists, I know has been instrumental in facilitating the exchange of data. What are some examples, additional examples of how it's currently being used in the federal government?
NEAM has realized a significant increase in adoption in the federal government. In the Department of Homeland Security, where my day job is, I can provide some examples. NEAM is being applied in the Disaster Assistance Improvement Program from FEMA to harmonize the 60 forms that one could apply for in a disaster situation. Amazingly enough, 80% of the data on those 60 forms is the same. And yet we make our citizens fill out those forms again and again and again. The FEMA Disaster Assistance Program is aimed at harmonizing that and allowing citizens to fill out most of that information once and pass that information to the agencies to ensure that those forms are pre-populated. To me, that's good government. The Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security has applied the use of NEAM in the e-verification and the self-check programs, allowing faster citizen services in a critical service that we provide. Outside of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice has a strong program around NDEX and law enforcement information sharing, a true banner best practice child from the beginning of the NEAM program. There are really great cases at the state level based on some of the federal level like to talk about in Colorado, New York City, and Massachusetts, where NEAM is being applied in child and family services. The really great part about NEAM is that people can use it. It is free to use, and I never have to know about it. I often don't know about it until I hear the good news, such as the New York Times article around the New York City's HHS Connect successes. They were able to provide streamlined citizen services to their citizens. As an example, an 18-year-old mother of a 1-year-old son who arrived in the city's homeless intake center. She had been removed from her own mother's house by ACF in September because of neglect. By typing her name into this new interface, the caseworker was able to, within minutes, find her birth certificate, her baptismal certificate, and her mother's driver's license to help her document her identity and housing history, which homeless services requires. So they think they took about 45 minutes out of a 6-hour intake process because of the work New York City's HHS Connect has done to bring together their information using the NEAM standard. And again, we didn't know they were doing it. We had no anticipation that NEAM would be used in human services when we started the program. These are all great sort of use cases around the community adoption and the community involvement in the use of a program originally started for law enforcement and Homeland Security information.
Thanks so much to both of you for your leadership. We have a vote underway, so I'll hold the rest of mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, and I apologize to our guests and to our witnesses that a vote intruded upon the proceedings right now. We will be back in 20 minutes. I would ask Ms. Roy and Secretary Sheldon if you'd please consider remaining. I believe some of our members do have some questions for you before we move on to our second panel of witnesses. Appreciate you being here today very much, and excited about the progress that we've made over the last year and a half working together. And with that, the subcommittee stands in recess for 20 minutes. The hearing is back in session, and we'll continue with our questioning of our first panel. The chair would I'd like to recognize Dr. Bustani from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing, and I know you've had a long interest in this interagency cooperation and how we can use data to drive this. Ms. Roy, why is it, you've been involved in all of this, trying to push this from the inside. Why is it so hard to reach consensus on standardization? I mean, what kind of describe some of the difficulties you've encountered going forward with all this?
Thank you, Congressman, for asking me that. If it were easy, I believe it wouldn't be so hard. It's such a big push to get people to adopt. Most of the objections we get are related to education and the time to adopt something new. A lot of misperceptions that it's hard to use or hard to sort of adopt another standard. We believe when we have a cogent conversation around the reuse potential, those conversations get easier to have. And sometimes we have the objections of not invented here. It's not my XML standard, as an example, so it's hard for me to sort of diverge and listen openly to a better way of doing business. But for the most part, sir, it's been about outreach and making sure that we have enough outreach activities out there to apply what we think is the good aspects of a program like NEAM out there to 3,000 counties, 50 states, and as an example, in Homeland Security, 18,000 police departments. It's just it's a pretty big country, and a lot of people to get to.
The magnitude of order. And
Yes, sir.
Secretary Sheldon, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, having seen this at a state level, we had in the agency that I ran, we had mental health, substance abuse, TANF, child welfare, domestic violence, and everyone is kind of used to their little silo. They're safe in it. And so I think, as I indicated in my testimony, it's the technology we know how to do, quite frankly, or Donna knows how to do. But it's the culture of sharing that has to happen. And I've been meeting with several state commissioners, and I think there is a growing realization at the state level, as there are declining resources, that there is a benefit to data exchange standardization. I think I met, for instance, with the Secretary of the Department in Virginia just last week. They are doing some extremely innovative things in Virginia, and I think other states are too, but Virginia may very well be one of those states that could be an example to other states, because what they're attempting to do is not just data standardization, but a growing sharing of information across lines. And ultimately, I think it's going to be when you include, when we get to the point where we're not just dealing with the human services domain, but we're also dealing with the health piece as well as with the education piece, because those three are so intricately linked.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. There was an irony I've experienced in my time in Congress. In 2005, late in 2005, I went to Iraq, and then on the way back stopped in Landstuhl, and when I was talking to the chief medical officer at the hospital in Landstuhl, where our wounded warriors were evacuated, what was interesting was the fact that we had good data from battlefield to Landstuhl, but when our guys left the Department of Defense and went over to the Veterans Administration, whole different database, lack of communication, and a lot of lost information, and a lot of frustration on the part of our veterans. So then I returned in 2008 to see if what changes were made, and basically nothing had changed. And so the irony is, here we are, an administration-driven push to implement health information technology to improve quality and collaboration, integration of health, and yet our own departments can't seem to get it together. And that's why I share Chairman Davis's intense interest in this issue because, as he said in his opening statement, with our budgetary constraints and all the other things that we're dealing with, this should be a no-brainer, although, albeit a very difficult task, given the magnitude and cultural issues. But and that's why I asked the question, to try to drill down a little further into what specific problems you're encountering going forward on all this. So if you could continue to work with us on these things and help us understand where the roadblocks are, what specifically is occurring, because we can pass legislation, but actual implementation and getting this right is a whole different story. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments. The chair recognizes Mr. Reed for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. Ms. Roy, I'm going to direct a lot of my conversation to you, as we've never really had. I don't think we've ever had a member of the Homeland Security team come here and testify before Human Resources Information on information issues and others. But I really kind of want to delve into the concern that NEAM potentially is out there for purposes of intelligence gathering, and can you dispel for me any of the issues that people are expressing, that this is confidential information, data that could potentially be exploited, or the concerns about privacy and issues like that, if you would?
Congressman Reed, those are very good questions. Thank you very much for asking them. NEAM is just a format for data as it moves. It does not imply that you're moving it anywhere, but it does provide a common vocabulary for someone who wants to send data to someone who wants to receive it, or more appropriately, network effect of multiple people who want to receive it in a way that they can understand it. So early when the HHS started to see the value of NEAM and have the conversations, I have read some sort of blogs out there that the CIA would get your health records. And sort of had to chuckle on that one because NEAM doesn't move the data. NEAM provides the format for which the data moves. In combination with NEAM are the implementations within a federal, state, local, or private sector agency even, who put in place security, privacy, and other aspects of the IT system that protects the data. So NEAM is not the data itself. It is just the format for which we agree upon sharing the data. The format has applicability across more than intelligence domains. It's the Homeland Security, the emergency management, the justice, the education, the transportation. There's a lot of domains where Donna Roy is Donna Roy, and the description of Donna Roy as a person, I have a name, date of birth, sex, all of those things are consistently the same across multiple domains across our government. That's where NEAM provides a significant amount of value.
Excellent. Mr. Sheldon, do you have anything to offer from HHS's point of view?
Well, I think that agencies are still going to be able to control their confidentiality requirements. When we moved in this direction in Florida, we had 3 what we called joint application design sessions. And the first 2 sessions were with programs as to what kind of information should I put up, what would be useful, and what would be useful across agency lines. And then in our 3rd session, we brought in the general counsels of those agencies. Many of the ideas that were brought up during the programmatic piece of those design sessions were included in our ultimate application. There were a few that didn't make it because of confidentiality concerns. And then we developed memorandums of understanding between all the agencies who were participating in that. So there was a memorandum of understanding between the sender agency and the receiver agency. And I think as we move forward, we're going to have to do that kind of collaboration in order to kind of break down some of these walls. I also think there's a lot of misconception about confidentiality and what is confidential. And I think there are a lot that we've learned that, for instance, if I've got a child who's in the child welfare system and that child is in care, it would be very helpful to the state child welfare agency to know how that child is doing in school. And yet that information now, under the current FERPA statutes, is not shareable. So I think a lot of these things, it's got to be a process where people have access who have a need to know. And obviously, when you deal with a child in the child welfare system, the extent to which you can interface with what's happening to that child in the education system, that's better off for the child. So those are the kinds of things I think that on an ongoing basis we're going to have to work through. I am very confident that from a technology standpoint we can do this, but I do think we have to break down a lot of these misconceptions that exist out there.
Well, and I would agree with that sentiment, the misconception about the ulterior motives potentially that are out there floating in the blogosphere and everywhere else. And I appreciate it, and I look forward to working with you to accomplish that.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, just to...
Please, we have some more time.
The same thing, we had a task force in Florida after the Virginia Tech killings. And what we found is that the folks in colleges in the mental health arena were not communicating with the people who had a need to know if, in fact, there were some dangers. That's the kind of ongoing dialogue I think institutions are going to have in order to not just make sure that we are covering fraud and abuse, but we're also protecting individuals at the same time.
Appreciate that. See, my time has expired. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I apologize for the disruption with the voting. It's one of those days, probably more typical than not. As you know, this committee's been working a lot on data standardization. And, you know, the programs that are within our jurisdiction, child welfare, TANF, and the unemployment insurance. And as you heard, Ranking Member Doggett and others, we've co-sponsored a bill to do the same thing in child enforcement, and really on a global basis. So my question really for Ms. Roy is, you know, on the bigger picture, as you look around all the things that government's involved with, are there other agencies and programs that are looking at standardization and doing some things that, you know, that kind of pop out as other examples?
There are, fortunately, we're in the business of being a free-to-use public service. I wish I knew all of the good news around the communities and the agencies that were adopting NEAM. And again, as I stated, I almost find out when I hear it in the press or there's someone bragging about a good news story. That being said, we're seeing a lot of positive movement in the human services arena in Colorado, in New York City, in Massachusetts, and there's an exponential growth factor every time one of those states shares its best practices. It's a little bit of a wildfire with this community-driven program that they foster conversations with the state near them or with someone else that's interested, and so we'll see this network impact of a community that's very, very involved. At the federal level, as I mentioned, we have almost all of the federal agencies doing something with NEAM. In particular, new domains, new content communities, and just around education, around transportation are encouraging because they have an impact on this cross-community information exchange. And so a child is a child. He goes to school. The child has, you know, might be part of a welfare program. It might get school lunch programs. And so that the NEAM was built to actually sustain that cross-business transactional support for data exchange.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up. Is there one thing, how do we encourage agencies to move in this direction? Is there something that we can do? Is there you said there was one thing that could be done by Congress to encourage that. What would it be? Other than more money.
We appreciate support in getting the word out. That NEAM is a tool for your constituents to use for better IT connections, for better sharing. We appreciate increased outreach on this. We're getting great support from the Federal CIO Council for the federal agencies. Every time we see a federal agency adopt, we see a ripple effect in the state, local agencies that also exchange information with the feds. And so I would say continued outreach in understanding that this is a valuable program that can help significantly increase mission performance.
All right, thank you. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to welcome now a distinguished member and long-serving member of the Ways and Means Committee, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health, the gentleman from California, Mr. Herger, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate an opportunity to sit on the panel. Mr. Sheldon, today there's been a lot of discussion about the positive of information sharing, but I want to bring it back to an issue that is easily overlooked and potentially more important. I want to discuss the safeguards that should be in place to ensure that the personal data of program beneficiaries is kept secret. As you may have heard from recent news reports, California's Department of Child Support Services lost computerized storage devices that were being transported as part of a disaster recovery test last month. These devices held the personal data of 800,000 parents, guardians, and children, compromising their names, addresses, driver license numbers, Social Security numbers, health insurance, and employer information. The news reports of the incident are extremely troubling. We do not have much information other than the devices went missing somewhere between Colorado and California. I want to make sure this security lapse is taken as seriously by the government agencies involved as by the families whose personal information has been lost. I'd like to know what safeguards states operating child support enforcement and other federal programs are required to have in place to protect personal data. Has HHS looked into the incident in California? And if so, did California's Department of Child Services violate any of the safeguards that should have been in place?
Congressman, I couldn't agree with you more. Our child support enforcement efforts nationally have had a 15-year unblemished record in terms of protecting data. We do take what happened in California extremely seriously. We immediately reached out to California when it came to our attention to determine, number one, the nature of the loss, what information was lost, the level of data exposure, and we are still working with them. And I have asked that we go back and look at our protocols of what we are requiring of states. I've been assured that there are a lot of protocols in place and in terms of making sure that states comply with confidentiality. But I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can in this area. We will continue to work with California. The information that we've gotten back to date indicates that I think that there were 5 canisters lost, and one of those has been regained. We requested that the state immediately identify the individuals, notify those individuals of the potential breach, and that is ongoing as we speak, I believe.
And Mr. Sheldon, could you tell me, what does your agency plan to do going forward to prevent this type of lapse from happening again?
Well, the first thing that we're doing is we're reviewing to make sure that states are maintaining the current safeguard requirements that we have in place. We currently are doing routine monitoring of states. We will increase that monitoring on an ongoing basis. I think, quite frankly, we also are identifying through a lot of those routine efforts if there were any unauthorized use of information. We are employing technical assistance teams to work with states in this arena. So I share your concern because I think this was a serious breach, and we are trying to double our efforts in working with states and holding them accountable.
Well, Mr. Sheldon, I appreciate your taking this seriously. Again, it's difficult to comprehend how something like this could happen.
And this was, as I understand it, a emergency disaster exercise, and to have this happen on that kind of exercise is in itself problematic, because the purpose of those exercises is just the opposite. I would point out that the state did have backup information, so there was no loss on the part of the state, but exposing confidential information of individual citizens, I think, is cause for serious alarm.
Well, again, I appreciate that, again, it's very important, as you can understand. Number one, to understand how this could have happened, even in basically a mock-up trial. Imagine what would happen if there was an actual emergency. But I think I'm sure you can understand how it's very important that we check and double check and make sure this doesn't happen again. And again, I thank you very much.
And Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to do is get back with you as we proceed, so that you know exactly what steps that we are taking as it relates to this particular breach.
I'd appreciate you doing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and want to thank both of our witnesses, Ms. Roy and Secretary Sheldon from the administration, discussing this issue with us and helping us understand the issue further. If members have additional questions, they'll submit them to you in writing, and we'd appreciate it if you would also give us a copy of that so that we can submit it into the official record. I want to thank you again. We look forward to continuing to work with you on improving data standardization to reduce cost and improve performance in the government. And with that, this concludes the first panel of the hearing, and I'd appreciate if the second panel would come forward.
Thank you
very much. Now we'll go ahead and begin the second panel. I appreciate our witnesses being here today. On our panel, we'll hear from Mr. Robert Doar, Commissioner of the Human Resources Administration for New York City, Ginger Zielinski, the Executive Director of Benefits Data Trust, Mr. Darrell McDonald, Executive Vice President of Terra Data Corporation, Campbell Pride, President and Chief Executive Officer of XBRL US. Appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to join us here in Washington. Mr. Doar, would you please proceed with your testimony?
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Davis and Ranking Member Doggett and members of the committee. I am Robert Doar, head of New York City's largest social service agency, HRA. Due to the structure set up in New York State, I help to manage over $39 billion in resources in an array of programs, including TANF, SNAP, Medicaid, and child support enforcement. Mayor Michael Bloomberg has made it a top priority to break down silos between city agencies so that we can improve the quality of services to the millions of participants in our programs and to properly administer and protect city, state, and federal tax dollars. He drew from his work in the private sector and saw we needed a better computer system to manage 8 health and human services agencies with 80 different case management systems, serving more than 3 million recipients and reporting to different state and federal oversight agencies. In 2008, we embarked upon HHS Connect to basically create a system to share information across multiple services, multiple agencies, so that we could better serve our citizens and clients. A key was the strong leadership provided by the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, Linda Gibbs, and the emphasis placed on this program on all commissioners in human services and city government. Presently, there are two major functions of HHS Connect that are underway: client access to information about benefits and services, and worker access to better data and holistic view of the client. Access NYC is the client portal. It is a screening tool to self-screen for more than 30 city, state, and federal human services benefit programs. Applicants can also apply online for SNAP, school meals, and senior citizen and disabled rental increase exemption programs. Recently, Medicaid renewals were added to the site, and since we began, 100,000 SNAP applications have been submitted online. To better assist clients on the worker side, we created Worker Connect to share information among agency workers. It is a secure, read-only, web-based application that allows select city workers to access a limited set of information from multiple data sources through one point of entry. The basic technical elements are a common client index and a document manager. The common client index is the initial process to link the client's identity within any of the participating agencies. The identifier is used to data mine details such as benefit information, case composition, and employment history, and display them to workers. And the document management is simple but has been very useful across agencies, an electronic repository of documents submitted by HRA clients when they applied for our benefit programs. On the program side, the key benefit of HHS Connect is how the information can be used. In our child welfare agency regularly uses Worker Connect. Child welfare workers use it to quickly identify and locate children and guardians they have difficult finding but are known to other city agencies. Oftentimes, the reports child welfare workers receive from a central registry are missing critical identifying information, especially when they are called in by anonymous sources. Worker Connect has alerted staff to the identity of household members and to the existence of another parent or other children who may be at risk. It has also been useful to our homeless agency's intake facility, where families showing up at the facility often do not have easy access to much of their documentation. And my agency also uses Worker Connect as an additional tool to identify fraud, abuse, and improper payments within public assistance programs. We use it for eligibility verification to quickly and accurately identify inconsistencies, particularly unreported income, between information provided to us on applications and that which has been submitted to other agencies. And in the future, we hope to use it to help identify patterns of potential fraud and abuse within the public assistance programs we administer. I need to be clear that information sharing was not undertaken lightly. There is an overarching requirement that access to information is only granted in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, and we strictly adhere to federal, state, and local laws governing the protection and use of confidential records maintained by our social services agencies. I believe there is definitely a role for the federal government to help in this area so that every other state or city trying to identify what data can be shared isn't overwhelmed with legal analysis and forced to recreate the wheel time and again. And I also believe that we need to be careful to recognize that the sharing of data is not synonymous with the sharing of eligibility rules. Although we strive to make sure that low-income individuals and families have appropriate access to benefits for which they are eligible, we need to be mindful of unintended consequences. Every program has different standards for how to consider resources and income and ultimately determine eligibility. And many of these differences are appropriate given the different goals of the programs. Therefore, discussions as to what extent programs that share common data or clients should share the same eligibility standards needs to be approached strategically. I thank the committee and the chairman for all of your work on addressing this important issue and for moving this important agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dorr. Ms. Zielinski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Congressman Davis, Congressman Doggett, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today and for your ongoing work in regards to the Standards Data Act. I'd like to start today by sharing a quote with you of one of our clients, a 58-year-old unemployment insurance exhaustee who is eligible for more than $200 a month in SNAP benefits. I was so shocked when I received your call. In the past 3 weeks, I've gone through 3 failed job interviews and I felt like a failure. This benefit amount is equivalent to my monthly mortgage payment, I'm so glad you didn't let me drop through the cracks. Benefits Data Trust is a national not-for-profit organization committed to transforming how people in need access public benefits. We've successfully completed over 280,000 benefit applications on behalf of low-income Americans through the use of data sharing strategies to target outreach and streamline the applications process. Maximizing private sector targeting and outreach strategies, Benefits Data Trust has been able to utilize more than 20 different targeted federal and state government agency data sources to conduct national, statewide, and regionally based outreach. We all know that data-driven strategies can and should combat fraud and create efficiencies in the verification process. I would like to share with you today 5 key points on how and why, right now, without prohibitive investments in technology, data sharing can and should be used to increase access into public benefits for the people who need it most. First, data sharing strategies can create vast opportunities to conduct targeted, cost-effective outreach. Federal and state agencies can share enrollment data internally, across departments, and with business and not-for-profits to generate targeted outreach lists of millions of individuals who are highly likely eligible and not enrolled in benefit programs. For example, in 2010, working with the Pennsylvania's Department of Labor and Industry and Department of Public Welfare, BDT identified 80,000 unemployment insurance exhaustees, commonly known as 99ers, who were likely eligible and not enrolled in SNAP. The 3 entities developed comprehensive data share agreements and a process to generate an automated monthly file of new exhaustees eligible for this outreach. The targeted outreach achieves initial response rates of 25%. In comparison, standard direct marketing delivers response rates of closer to 1%. Results show that many individuals we help are not familiar with the safety net system at all and have never needed help before. Nationally, in the last year, more than 5.5 million people have exhausted their unemployment insurance benefits. This illustrates the tremendous opportunity and responsibility we have to help folks grappling with the recent economic recession. Second, data sharing strategies can streamline the applications process and create express lane eligibility opportunities. In Philadelphia, Benefits Data Trust receives an automated monthly data file of individuals 60 and over who were recently enrolled or were certified for Medicaid and not enrolled in SNAP. Since income, residency, and Social Security number or non-citizenship status were just verified by the same department, an individual does not need to provide proof of these elements on their SNAP application. Therefore, eligible individuals are able to apply for SNAP in one phone call without having to provide any additional documentation. This dramatically streamlines the application process for the applicant and the verification process for the administering agency, reducing the cost of outreach, application assistance, and eligibility determination. New enrollment in recertification in Medicaid, TANF, HEAT assistance, or the Earned Income Tax Credit approval is an opportune moment to help people access other benefits they need and create express lane eligibility opportunities. Third, increasing access to public benefit programs for people that are eligible, especially seniors, helps individuals, it strengthens our local economies, and it reduces long-term national health care costs. Fourth, data-driven strategies can cut outreach and application assistance costs by more than 70%. Fifth, there are several actions that the federal government can take to make it easier for government, business, and not-for-profits to utilize data sharing strategies. The federal government can take a proactive approach by setting guidance around standard data share and data security provisions. This will immediately provide government agencies, business, and not-for-profits clarity on how to share and protect data. Continuing to fund technical upgrades and integrations of state systems, as well as projects that utilize data-driven approaches to outreach and enrollment, will continue to enhance improvements in this area. I'd like to end with one last quote, an 82-year-old woman that we were able to apply for both food stamps and the low-income subsidy. I don't even know how you found me. My husband died of Alzheimer's, and we both worked all of our lives. His treatment ate up all of our money. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zielinski. Mr. McDonald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Davis and distinguished members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm Darrell McDonald, representing Teradata Corporation. And for 30 years, Teradata has redefined the lead of database technology and the use of advanced analytics. Among the nearly 1,400 Teradata customers, companies such as eBay, Walmart, Wells Fargo, Caterpillar, and AT&T have learned how to recognize data as their most valuable asset by transforming that data into useful information. These same approaches can be applied to the government. My testimony today will focus on how applying advanced analytic solutions to massive data sets, or big analytics, helps federal agencies meet complex, large-scale mission demands despite unprecedented budget cuts and infrastructure. It's important to remember that big analytics aren't futuristic or incomprehensible. In fact, one of the best-known examples is from Major League Baseball, the 2002 Oakland A's. As described in the book Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game, and the subsequent movie and feature film, the A's used data analytics to more effectively compete against other teams using less money. A lesser-known example is from one of our state government customers is found in Michigan. Since 1996, the state of Michigan has been creating their enterprise data warehouse, which supports reduced health care cost and a 25% reduction in administrative cost. The Michigan Enterprise Data Warehouse has also aided the state in many ways, including doubling the recoveries for Medicaid fraud, moving from last to first in child immunization rates, and identifying more than $70 million in fraudulent child care. Imagine the benefits achieved by Michigan at the scale of federal government. Giving federal decision makers the ability to utilize all the data on hand to find underlying insights is essential for effective risk management, cost containment, and mission success. Rather than making weak decisions with data sampling, big analytics utilize all the available data to enable fact-based decisions. Big data analytics cuts analysis time from weeks or months to near real time, and enabling continuous improvements to meet changing technology, regulatory, and mission needs. As one of the world's largest creators and consumers of data, the federal government will see its long-term future of success or failure linked to how well it addresses big data. Teradata has numerous and varied success stories of helping clients integrate and understand and leverage big data at the federal and state levels within and outside the U.S. For example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Risk Management Agency has successfully applied data and analytics within the federal crop insurance program. By bringing together disparate data to identify and combat fraudulent claims, the agencies have saved the American taxpayers approximately $838 million in improper payouts from 2001 to 2011, with cost avoidance estimated at $1.5 billion. Another example is the U.S. Transportation Command. The legacy information systems used by Transportation Command limited the visibility to historic and current shipment and arrival detail. Today, data from 33 different systems is integrated to improve decisions with near real-time visibility across the Department of Defense. A final example is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the CMS beta dashboards. Completed within 5 weeks, the initial dashboard was launched early because, among other reasons, the historical claim data was housed in a single system. With many organizations seeing tremendous benefit, a logical next question is, how do we motivate more government agencies to adopt big analytics? In that respect, Mr. Chairman, the timing of this hearing couldn't be better. Teradata strongly supports H.R. 3339 and respectfully requests Congress to pass this legislation. Not only would this legislation improve cost-effective delivery of essential services to millions of Americans, but it would also create a stepping stone for other government agencies to understand and acquire the benefits of big analytics. Consider the lessons from Moneyball. If analytics can change a 100-year-old sport like baseball, think of the possibilities for government. Once again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your continued leadership on this issue, and Teradata stands ready to support you and your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Pride?
Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here to discuss the use of standards to improve government reporting. I am Campbell Pride, President and CEO of Expero US, a non-profit organization established to support the implementation of standardized business reporting by government and business through marketplace collaboration. I applaud you and other members of Congress who are striving to make government more effective and efficient by using data standards. I will briefly discuss one such standard, Extensible Business Reporting Language, or XBRL. XBRL is a data standard that is used to communicate financial and performance-related data by both business and government. The objective of XBRL is to enable compatibility and comparison of the data that is being standardized. The shipping container is a useful analogy to demonstrate the importance of data compatibility. The standardized shipping container revolutionized the way that products were transported from the manufacturer to the consumer. It increased the speed of delivering products to market and reduced perishable waste. It reduced transfer costs between ships, trucks, and rail. No longer did it separate products, have to be manually loaded onto trucks, restacked onto ships, and offloaded onto trains. This also drastically reduced loss through theft. It ultimately changed the design of ships and trains to accommodate the new shipping containers, allowing both ships and trains to carry far more cargo. And finally, it reduced storage costs because cargo is moved more quickly and it could be stacked at storage facilities. All of these gains were the result of developing a global standard for shipping containers. The manufacturer, the shipping company, and the transportation companies realized that they could drastically reduce handling costs with a simple, standardized solution that was compatible between trucks, trains, and ships. Today's management of financial reporting data in government resembles the transport industry before the introduction of the shipping container. The implementation of data standards, such as XBRL, can improve the speed, reduce the transfer costs between systems, allow more data to be moved, and reduce storage costs by allowing storage in one format. In addition to compatibility, data standards also facilitate the comparison of data. By standardizing financial and performance data, it can be quickly compared. This allows data to be easily aggregated and disaggregated, giving the users the ability to disaggregate or drill down into information, provides improved transparency and the ability to compare, for example, the relative performance of recipients of federal funds. It is important, however, that everyone uses the same standard. Standards, just like electrical plugs, are standardized within countries, but unlike the shipping container, they are not global. This lack of standardization requires the needs for adapters and transformers to use the same product across countries. The use of different data standards across agencies will result in the same problem. Some recent legislation has suggested the use of XML as a reporting standard. XML is a flexible data standard that, like electrical plugs, can use different formats to deliver electricity, or in this case, information. Allowing agencies to use their own variants of XML to communicate financial reporting data will result in data compatibility issues between agencies and will minimize the ability of taxpayers or policymakers to efficiently analyze such information. XBRL is a specific data standard based on XML that ensures that reported financial information is compatible and comparable across all agencies. Moreover, XBRL eliminates the need for adapters or transformers to transfer comparable financial data between users. Data standards like XBRL will ensure that financial and performance information can be transported in a cost-effective way and be timely from creation through to analysis. This will enable you as policymakers to monitor and track government spending, as well as use up-to-date financial information to make appropriate future allocation decisions. It will also allow the federal, state, and local agency and other recipients of federal funds to analyze how those funds are used. Most importantly, using data standards like XBRL to communicate this information will reduce cost, increase speed, increase transparency, and increase the effectiveness of taxpayer dollars spent. XBRL US has vast experience and expertise in XBRL development through our work with the SEC and the FDIC, and we are ready and available to help Congress and those in other federal and interested state agencies in this important initiative. Thank you again for having us here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pride. I appreciate all of your testimony. We appreciate your perspectives on this important topic. And before we move to questions, I'd also like to insert a letter from the Kentucky Society of CPAs into the record without objection. So ordered. When we started this data standards effort, it was based on a question about what was going on in programs under the jurisdiction of the committee. For me, from a personal perspective, to give you an idea, coming from the private sector, working with data integration in retail, business-to-business environments, early in the standardization with electronic data transfer, before the internet fully stood up, and then saw the beginning of that coming in, I sat down with the subcommittee and I asked a question as the new chairman, how do I get a cost roll-up? For those in the audience who might not be familiar with that, the idea of saying if I take what would be called a vendor master, similar to what the gentlewoman, Ms. Roy from NEAM, talked about with data matching across standards, trying to find out exactly if we had the means of understanding who was on all of what programs with one given record, similar to some of the initiatives Mr. Doerr's taking. And the answer was we can't do that. And that literally was the genesis moment from years of discussion about data standardization to move forward and talk about this. So I appreciate all of you being here. You know, we knew there was a lot of program overlap within our programs that creates additional cost and overhead, takes away taxpayer dollars, and doesn't help beneficiaries. We also knew there were serious questions about program effectiveness that current data could not successfully answer, especially when there are multiple programs that are involved. And the data standardization effort that we put in place will eventually get us to the point of being able to address these questions and concerns, we believe. So far, we've made considerable progress with child welfare, with temporary assistance to needy families, with unemployment insurance, and hopefully soon child support enforcement. However, if we're going to take a beneficiary-centered approach to better using data standards in the administration of public benefit programs, it needs to be the most complete view, and that probably means programs outside the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, like food stamps, Medicaid, housing, Medicare, and Social Security. Mr. Doerr, I'll start with you. As we look to expand this effort, from your experience, what human service programs should we seek to include in this effort?
Well, the one we struggle with the most is the schools. The regulations, and those may be beyond your jurisdiction, but the regulations
We'd be glad to bring that under the
access to data concerning children in the New York City public school system is very firm. They are not participating, and they feel constrained that they cannot participate. And I think data concerning enrollment and what's happening in schools would be good for us in social services, and it would be good for them in education. So that would be the area that we're most frustrated by at this point. Child support enforcement is great. We have food stamps, we have Medicaid, we have cash assistance, we have housing, but the one that we struggle with is schools.
I appreciate your perspective. Just my wife and I have volunteered with kids and families on the edge for over 25 years, and the one consistency, particularly now, is our oldest daughter is a school teacher dealing with at-risk children, where you have, and I'm sure the same phenomenon in New York as we do in our small little part of the world, moving multiple schools sometimes within a year, and even within the schools they can't share information about the kids, which creates a real educational challenge as well, not to mention the lack of connectivity. Ms. Zielinski, your organization works primarily with seniors, correct?
That is correct.
What are the most common combinations of programs that seniors are usually eligible for but that they might not receive?
Sure. To help seniors reach and maintain economic security, we really need to look at housing, health care, and basic living costs. So obviously housing is the biggest indicator of whether or not an individual will be able to reach and maintain economic security. We also then, that would also include heat assistance or the LIHEAP program. Then we talk about health care. Obviously, if we take a look at poverty among seniors and actually include health care costs in that calculation, millions of seniors are in poverty and struggling to meet their health care costs. In addition, then we also have food. So combining those programs as we take a look at helping low-income seniors in America is critical.
Mr. Doerr or Ms. Zielinski, either one, is there certain program data that you wish you had that could further streamline your organization's efforts?
Yes.
In my case, the other area that is a
than that
constraint is the Social Security Administration.
Okay.
A lot of what we have done with HHS Connect was limited because some data we get as a result of previously established matches with the Social Security Administration. And to the extent that we got data from them through a match, there are very strong prohibitions against our ability to share what they gave us outside of our area. And that is a problem because that leads HHS Connect to not be complete. So a worker could look and see if there's any information, but couldn't be sure that by their not being there on a particular case that it's not there somewhere, but if we got it from SSA. So that would be another area where this initiative could be even more successful if that kind of federal guidance allowed us to go in that direction.
Thank you. Ms. Zielinski, briefly.
Sure. That being said, I think that the Medicare Improvement in Providers Act, or commonly known as MIPA, has great strides in how Social Security and the low-income subsidy data has been able to be shared with the states. I think when you start talking about challenges relating to access points of which data is available, it gets down into talking with states and lawyers about what is able to be shared and how it can be used. So it's not necessarily the data set so much that I would say that there's an opportunity for access. Obviously, Medicaid is going to be the most telling in terms of if we're really talking about reaching the most poor to receive support. But it's more about guidance around how different agencies, business and community partners can share data while also protecting an individual's privacy rights.
Great.
Mr. Chairman, could I just add also, when we put Medicaid data on HHS Connect, we only put the fact that they are eligible or they are Medicaid recipient. Claims data is also very strictly limited in our ability to share. And that, in many contexts, particularly for very vulnerable people, people who are high users of Medicaid, knowing the extent to which they are taking advantage of Medicaid provider services and those services are being claimed on their behalf would be very helpful in both limiting costs and getting better care.
I appreciate the perspective that both of you shared. Just in closing, the thing that I would say, we met early on with the Inspector General of the Social Security Administration, and I think that in all of the agencies we've met with, leadership understands the importance of sharing. There may be some issues that have to be addressed statutorily that would legitimately protect privacy, but allow encrypted data to be shared with those who are overseeing the service as well. And that'll be a continued discussion as this implementation moves forward. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Washington State, the former chairman of this subcommittee, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Mr. Davis, and we're going to miss you because this issue of data is a huge problem. I go back to the days in the state of Washington when we tried to put welfare mental health data on a database so that when a mental patient showed up in this clinic and then showed up in that hospital, then showed up across the state, we would have some way of someone knowing what had happened before. And we ran into all kinds of problems. And I also have spent a lot of time in trying to get data in the military medical system and the Veterans Administration medical system to talk to one another. You have a proprietary system in the military that doesn't talk to the publicly developed system in the VA. And so a guy gets blasted in Afghanistan and it gets put out of the Army and into the VA, and his medical records. So if you go to the hospital in Seattle, the doctors are sitting there with two computers, one with the military system and one with the VA system. It is absolutely insane. I mean, this data thing would make better health care, would make better all of our social systems. So I commend Mr. Davis for bringing this. What I'm interested, Ms. Zielinski, is this. How much, you're talking Pennsylvania. How wide across the country? Is there any, does your organization work in other states doing this? Or are there agencies in all the 40, 50 states?
Sure.
How is it working to use this data? What you're trying to do is you're actually looking for people eligible for benefits.
Correct.
And so you're using whatever data system. So tell me what's going on in the rest of the country, because you're our only window into 50.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. We've actually been able to conduct outreach nationally, and we have been able to conduct outreach in other states in addition to Pennsylvania, and are exploring opportunities in some of our partner states. I think to your point, different states have different makeups or the puzzle of how their data sits. The information that we seek to gain access to is not terribly deep. So it is very possible to pull automated files once you start getting to the right data folks that are in the different state departments. So it crosses agencies, and the landscape is different. So where does food stamp sits, and where does Medicaid sit, how it's set up in New York City is not necessarily how it's set up in Pennsylvania or Virginia or New Mexico.
Let me ask a question, a specific question, and it's an issue you brought up, which is one that's troubled me because of this committee. You have the people who have had middle-class experience, and they lose their job, and 99 weeks later, they come to the end of that, and they have nothing.
Yes.
And they have no idea of the social service system, number one. Number two, they are too embarrassed to go over to the welfare office and see if they qualify, or wherever you have to go on this food stamp stuff. How does it work for states trying to find those people, or are most states just saying if we don't hear about it, we don't need to worry about it? Or how are they dealing with the 99ers who are out there eating into their 401ks to keep the house,
right,
eligible for food stamps? And
I think that there's wide variety of what states are doing, and I don't have necessarily a longitudinal study, but would be more than happy to get back to you about what are other efforts. And I know that there's a lot of other national advocacy organizations engaged in talking about 99ers. To your point, about 40% of the or 45% of the folks that we help with the Unemployment Insurance Exhaustive Outreach Project are over the age of 50. So exactly what you're saying, that they're spending down their small nest egg. They never thought that they were going to be in the situation that they found themselves in. These are the individuals that are in great risk of foreclosure. So the kind of how it connects is very integrated. And I almost pulled a quote of an individual who's an MBA, and for 2 years he's been searching for a job and had to overcome the stigma and pride of, obviously he's a hard worker if he was able to get an MBA, and now all of a sudden he's in need. And overcoming that stigma is something that I think illustrates how important not only thinking about data in terms of fraud and creating efficiencies, that's absolutely critical, but we also need to think about it in terms of how we can help folks that are teetering on falling into poverty.
could you say something about New
Yeah,
York?
I would just add that programs that we run in New York City are well known to the populace. There's lots of promotional activities that go on. Food stamps is, the USDA is running advertisements promoting food stamp benefits. The number of people who take advantage of these benefits are quite large now in the city, food stamps and Medicaid particularly. In the case that you talk about, people who exhaust unemployment insurance tend to turn to health insurance, public health insurance first, then perhaps food stamp benefits, and then last TANF. But the other thing is that in New York City, the mayor continues to have an expectation that people who are struggling should work and need to, personal responsibility matters a significant amount. So we have to be careful about the extent to which we are overly promoting the receipt of public assistance as a substitute for personal responsibility and employment.
Could I ask one question of him? One more question?
Briefly, yes.
Yesterday, we eliminated the social services block grant. How much of that comes to your department, and what's it used for?
Well, at HRA, the Adult Protective Services Program is a program that serves our most vulnerable population. We have about 9,000 people who have been determined unable to care for themselves in any way. And that's a program we're going to have to run, and people we're going to have to serve. 75% of the funding for that program in HRA comes from the federal government. So to the extent that we get less SSBG money for adult protective services, the mayor will have to make up the difference, and that's a fiscal burden on us. And it's not a population, it's a particularly vulnerable population, and I think from the mayor's perspective, if he had a choice of federal programs that are in need of a reduction, that might not be the first one, particularly as it affects adult protective services.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair and I recognize Mr. Paulson from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the panel, there was recently an announcement for this year's Human Services IT Conference. It was called ISM, and the announcement listed sessions on the usual new service delivery models, emerging technologies, and general best practices. But what caught my eye, what drew a little bit of attention, I think, was this session description that said this. It said, quote, "The era of big data has arrived at ISM. State and federal agencies are looking to advanced data analytic capabilities and proven predictive modeling to reveal patterns of behavior, and outcomes that were previously buried in mountains of data. ISM 2012 data analytics sessions show how big data can turn into big discoveries. Mr. McDonald, how are big analytic efforts different than what our agencies are doing now? And do you agree that this is what agents should be doing in the future? Is this the direction to go? And what is the difference between data and data analytics today versus 30 years ago?
Sure. Yeah, the answer is yes. I think what's happening is the amount of data is doubling extremely fast just from traditional organic data. With all the new digital data that's being created and leveraged across the different agencies, you can imagine that the data that they're having to wrestle with is overwhelming. So you really have to start looking at instituting business rules and analytics to help mine that data based upon the kinds of goals that you set and the outcomes you want to get. And then more importantly, how do you push that out to the frontline government and agency workers so that they're able to make decisions more quickly on things that cross in front of them. So I would say today, people are overwhelmed with the data, and we have to use technology to take that overwhelming aspect out of it and try to give them the actions they should take based upon what's sitting in front of them. And again, whether it's private corporations or government agencies, they're all struggling with this. And I would say what's happened is that the amount of data has changed over the past 30 years, but more importantly, the complexity of it. So as you talk about this unstructured or big data, it really is marrying up new data types with traditional data types, which says you've got to understand how to read and integrate both, but more importantly, take that confusion out of it, simplify it, and give people on the front lines the types of activities and actions they should take based upon what rules you set in place and the outcomes you want to get.
Well, let me ask this for the for the rest of the panel then, because we're going to find a lot of information, obviously, in these mountains of data that are out there. And Ms. Linsky, I think in your testimony mentioned that we're going to be able to connect individuals to benefits so that they may not have been getting these benefits before. We're going to be able to tie that together. How about the converse? Will we be able to make strides down the road to make sure that only, for instance, people that are eligible for programs like low-income people that are able to get welfare benefits, get those benefits, that programs that require work activity, can we ensure that that actually happens? Can we tie the data in that fashion to make sure we're going to see some progressive results there?
I think that there's absolutely opportunity to be comprehensive in how we use data, that we certainly don't want to have people that are not eligible for these programs receiving them. That being said, we want to make sure that people that are eligible are able to access them so that they can get themselves out of poverty and to self-sufficiency. Certainly, there is accuracy components of using data. But if we look at, for example, the SNAP program in Pennsylvania, there's a payment accuracy challenge of 0.1%. So there's a fraud issue of 0.1%. So I think that it's critical that when we're talking about data, that we don't just talk about it in the frame of fraud. Absolutely critical, but we also talk about it in terms of making sure that we're helping the right people in a comprehensive way so that they can get out of poverty.
So, Mr. Dorr, in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse,
yes, we absolutely see the benefits of this kind of sharing of data to see inconsistencies in income reporting and work status and household status that would allow us to be sure that our programs are being expended correctly. And the most exciting use of big data from our standpoint in the city is the potential use to identify households where there is a potential child welfare issue in the future. And that you could use data to find what are risk factors in advance of unfortunate circumstances happening. And that's, I think, where we're right now trying to find what tells us, what does a child welfare protective services worker, what do they need to know that would lead them to say this is a more potentially risky family than another family, so that we can prevent tragedies from occurring.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Berg from North Dakota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure exactly where to start, but it keeps, as we've talked in this panel, it keeps coming back to me that nothing measured gets managed. And I think out here it's nothing that's measured, it won't get managed unless it's measured, but it won't get managed unless it's looked at. You know, and that's what kind of I cringe at, is just the mountain of information, a lot of really great information that would really help us as policymakers make decisions when we get to the point where we're going to make decisions. So, you know, I'm looking at kind of the big picture. My question really relates to standardization. And so, you know, again, kind of like boiling this down, we're going to look at a program, and we make a big effort to really look at that program. But within our scope, there's so many other programs that affect that individual that's within that program, and yet we're just kind of looking at that program somewhat in isolation. And you know, we're looking at this international child support law and what it's doing. And one of the things that we're looking at there is tapping into the National Directory of New Hires. And we're kind of, you know, looking at that as a way to expedite a lot of information and hopefully lower the cost of a lot of these programs. That information will be right there. And I think that's ultimately what we want to do, is that, you know, have some uniformity and make sure we're delivering those very efficient and cost effective. So maybe it's kind of a bigger question, but the question is, how would standardization help us when we're reviewing and evaluating programs? I mean, is it worth the effort to move towards standardization because that benefit's going to be there? So it's kind of a question for each member of the panel. If you...
It would absolutely help us. I mean, one of the theories of the post-welfare reform world was that we have a combination of programs that can serve as work supports. And so we want to know if people are working and taking advantage of SNAP, public health insurance, perhaps other forms of assistance. It's good to know how those programs work together for an individual client and whether they work together for how many. And so the analytical opportunities that we can see if we get greater standardization across programs, so that we can know who's a multiple program user or who is not and why not. And I absolutely agree about the National New Hires Database. I come from the Child Support Program. It is a tremendous resource and has even more greater potential than it's currently being used for. So there's no question that standardization will allow us to see how these, not just how these programs work by themselves, but how they work in concert with other programs and with employment, which is, I think, what we're all trying to do. No.
Thank you for the question. The primary focus of our work has been on older Americans, and there's been great work done with the Elder Index, which does exactly what you're talking about. And I think that, to your answer, absolutely standardization around what an individual needs to reach and maintain economic security is critical as we explore how to support our older Americans. That being said, we also need to take into consideration that the cost of living in New York City, for example, is probably different than in North Dakota.
Some parts of North Dakota are getting pretty expensive.
So the Elder Index does just that. It's out of the wider opportunities for women, and the National Council on Aging is also engaged in a lot of work around economic security for older Americans. So I think, I guess, a caution as we look at standardization, it's critical. We also need to look at the environment in which those individuals are trying to thrive.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the standardization is really what's got to be the starting point for trying to take this complexity out of the different programs and agencies, and the investment in that will reduce the amount of future investment that you have to deploy on programs for them to be able to share information and get value out of that information, both from a cost-saving standpoint, but more importantly, how to reallocate it to the right programs and the right mission. So I think it's just fundamentally the right place to start.
Yeah, and one of the advantages, the other advantages is you don't get the data stuck in systems. Everyone's using a different system. There's no way these systems can talk to each other. If we have standards across an agency and then interagency, one system can talk to another seamlessly. I can request some information. It can go down to all those systems and pull it on the fly. As you don't have to have the case where you have different computer screens to log into each different system.
Well, thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair now recognizes Dr. Bustani from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under our subcommittee's jurisdiction, we have two programs, SSI and unemployment insurance, that have both been deemed high-error programs by the Office of Management and Budget. In fact, just in the fiscal year 2011 alone, they combined to account for $18.3 billion in improper payments. Mr. McDonald, I read through your testimony, and you had a lot of detail in there referencing the work that you all have done in Michigan with regard to fraudulent child support. I would like you to elaborate for the committee a little more on, about that work and what steps could we take at the federal level to implement some of your best practices?
Sure. Yeah, I think what the state of Michigan decided to do was build a platform that integrated this information across all of their different programs. And they knew by doing so, they would not only provide better customer satisfaction to those people that are using the programs, but they would link that information to find fraud and abuse, and then take that extra money and apply it back to those programs that were underfunded. So they were able, by putting in things around the tax, the health care, all of that into one environment. Think about the simplicity of, I come and get a new driver's license, but I haven't been paying my child support. Instantly, you're able to connect those two and then start trying to regroup those benefits, right? So just the simplicity of connecting different programs and agencies' information gives you that instant insight of, first, being a better provider to those taxpayers, but secondarily, catching fraud at the moment it happens, instead of having to wait a year later to determine if we've been overpaying or underpaying in certain areas. So I think it's very common practice in the business side, and I think it's now becoming an opportunity in the government and federal side to start looking at that same benefit they can reap by consolidating the data, standardizing the data, and giving access and interoperability to the different agencies in a quick fashion so that they can catch things both proactively and defensively.
Thank you. And at a time when we know we have a number of duplicative programs with a lot of overlap, and concomitantly we're dealing with budgetary problems, looking at the effectiveness of these programs is critically important. And it seems to me that what you just described would also help us in our oversight role to sort of paring down, figuring out how to most efficiently use those resources. Is that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think too often people ask about, how much money do you need? And I think not enough is put into what will be the impact or return of that investment in doing so. And in most cases, what we're seeing, especially like the state of Michigan, they spent a few $1 million, but they got $15 back for every dollar they invested. Who wouldn't like that formula for investing to try to take cost out and then return that money back, right? So as you can see, understanding the impact, but also everyone now operates under a similar fashion. So whether you're Bank of America or you're CMS, in reality, projects are 12-month based, they're program based. You have to spend money and see that return in a quick fashion, but you have to have a view as to where am I going to be in 3 years? Am I incrementally improving the overall process versus this program approach and a 12-month approach, which has no start and end and accountability that should be held.
Thank you. And from the time the first set of data standards were included in the child welfare programs to the next iteration in TANF and unemployment programs, the language went from suggesting a standard like XBRL to suggesting XML. Some of the concerns that were expressed were that XBRL was too expensive or too complicated to implement, and the feedback we've received was that we should only recommend that the agencies implement XML. So, Mr. Pride, could you respond to those criticisms for us? Is it too complicated or too expensive?
It depends what you're trying to do. So XBRL is specifically designed for reporting financial and performance data. It's not designed for reporting information like biometric information or judiciary information or case information. It's specifically designed for financial reporting. To use XBRL for sharing information about a child's condition or other health operational issues, XBRL would not be appropriate in that case, and it would be silly to do that. There are other standards that NEAM has been involved in developing, and they would be more appropriate in those cases. However, if you're going to report financial reporting information like how much is this agency spending, how much are we spending on this program, and over what period are we spending it, how much have we invested, and what's the cost, etc., then XBRL is an appropriate standard to use in that purpose. If you ask that question, let's use XBRL to standardize every single piece of data, yes, that would be correct. It would not be appropriate to do that.
I thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Reed from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses on the second panel. And being from New York, I want to spend a little time with my fellow New Yorker here.
All right.
If we could, I'm very interested, read your testimony, particularly page 6 and 7, talking about the lessons that you learned as you implemented the programs in your agency in New York City. And I want to kind of delve into a little bit more detail as to what you could offer us from your experience in implementing that. In particular, also, The interaction you referenced, a problem with Social Security numbers, and the
Yeah.
Social Security Administration. Obviously, they are such a large agency with tons of data
Right.
that needs to be part of this conversation, in my opinion. So I'm very interested in your point of view on what lessons you learned that we could learn from here in the Washington, D.C.
Well, one of the
Take
lessons
that.
we learned is that the direction from the top had to be emphatic, that the lawyers had to do everything they possibly could and be as imaginative and as persistent in trying to make a legal and appropriate, if not inappropriate, argument for allowing the sharing of data. Because bureaucracies, as I think the previous panel mentioned, are inherently narrow and afraid of doing something that someone may say in rare circumstances was wrong or not consistent with the policy. So that was a very important lesson, and we really pushed our lawyers to really think creatively and set up the process whereby those agencies that receive data had to sign a form where the commissioners committed to enforcing confidentiality and security rules on employees that violated them, and to report back to the giving agency so that we were consistent. We had an advantage that in New York State, social services is governed by a sort of an umbrella agency, and that is mine, and so that I could delegate to sister agencies the role of being social services, and then we're in a social services purpose. But one lesson is to get the lawyers and have the mayor's, the chief executive's position be very strongly felt that this was something we were going to try hard to do. Social Security administrative data is data we use now in certain programs, and we use it based on established agreements with SSA that have taken a long time to be established, that have allowed us to get data, and their prohibitions against the sharing of that data are very firm. And so one of the things our lawyers had to do was not allow that data from that source to be used in the way that we wanted to. And that's a problem that we would would like to work on nationally. Also, there are HIPAA requirements involving the sharing of Medicaid or health data, which we basically agree with. This is private data. This is something that should not be shared inappropriately. But claims data, as opposed to just being on Medicaid, but actually just how much is being expended on the client in Medicaid and where, is strictly prohibited. So we don't share that, and that's a problem, which we think we could make greater work with this if we had that available to our sister agencies and to ourselves in a way that could be used. And then finally, we would constantly come up to situations where we were looking at, I'm on a task force that looks at the gap between African American children and white children in schools. And we know that exists, and education wants us to work with them on that, and we want to work with them on that, but we don't share any data. So we don't know about the use of public assistance within schools by children, and they don't know it either. And in both cases, I think it would be useful. So those are the frustrations that have occurred. That it required real work. It required somebody holding the bureaucratic, narrow individual agencies accountable, and it ran into some barriers we just couldn't get through with regard to sharing data.
Well, I appreciate that. Mr. McDonald, from your experience in the private sector, I mean, if we leave SSA out of this conversation and kind of don't really focus on that, do you see a problem how that could impact the development of standardization across the agency? I mean, such a large agency and such a large amount of data. I just want to know from your perspective, would that work in the private sector?
I think in the private sector, they have, come to realize the importance of standardization across corporations. So I think through the evolution of how they've gone through mergers, acquisitions, and growth, they've all had to realize that unless we standardize on whether it's financial data, product data, or customer data, how will they be able to roll these companies and report on that? So I think no matter the size, there's enterprises bigger than many of the agencies that have done that. So is it doable? Yes. Is it required? Yes. I think it's just a matter of putting the energy, the standards behind it, and energies behind it that says, let's adopt this. And I think what you'll see is that once you start, 5 years from now, you'll say, why didn't we do that 10 years ago? So it's just a matter of making that first step and getting everyone committed to this is what we have to do to get to where we want to be, so let's stop talking about it.
I appreciate that. With that, my time has expired, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York. I just have to tell you the little huddle that was going on over here in the early part of Mr. Reed's question. Your testimony has inspired two of our subcommittee members to come up with another piece of legislation to complement what we're doing for data sharing in the healthcare side, our two doctors on the subcommittee. As we wrap up, I'd like to ask one final question. It's open to all to comment, but I'd like to start first with Mr. Pride and then with Mr. McDonald on this issue of analytics and standards. I'm going to preface this by saying coming into government from a world dealing with implementations focusing on internal rate of return and the idea that I can make an investment and know, particularly for those of you who have all dealt with what you might call a return on information, a dollar spent on information improvement can usually return itself 15 or 20 or 50 times what was spent in improvements of efficiency, throughput, the agility to respond to unique customer needs because of that access to information. Unfortunately, the Congressional Budget Office is trapped in another era and focuses on dynamic or static rather than dynamic scoring, which is our issue to address and looking at the value of this. But speaking of value, I would appreciate it if Mr. Pride could talk a little bit about the importance of standards. I'm very familiar with XBRL, not from a programming standpoint, but one of the very first pieces of legislation that I introduced, the Transparency and Financial Reporting Act back in 2005, was directly built around the idea of using things like XBRL and XML to harmonize processes, bring best practices to the SEC and other related organizations with financial services accountability, and also, frankly, to offset some of the huge compliance costs imposed with legacy systems with Sarbanes-Oxley. And I was wondering if you could comment on the value that comes in terms of payback by the implementation of these kinds of common standards, and then the analytics that would come, from some real-world examples. And I'm quite open to private sector, since the government is generally a lagging indicator of what's happening out in the country.
Yeah, sure. So we recently issued a white paper just covering how much government reporting that is required by companies. We can make that available to the committee, and it kind of backs up what Donna Roy was saying, where 80% of the information was repeated information that they were reporting to different agencies. So you get a massive amount of duplication in data because no one's sharing the data because got no way of sharing it. So you get significant efficiencies through that. In addition, there was a XBRL implementation that was carried out by the FDIC 5 years ago to collect call report data. This information was a very arduous process. It was called call report data because they had to go around and call everyone when they submitted the data incorrectly. So that severely, they could check the data on submission, so that reduced all the manual costs that went back involved in checking on the data and getting it correct. So a lot of the stuff, once you standardize it, you've created a platform for automation. Everything can be automated. Every SEC filing that is filed with the SEC, we analyze. We run 12,000 checks on it. We probably do. We find out so much information about these companies, which would have been impossible to do before. So we have this information. We can go back to companies, go back to their auditors with it. So you end up in an era where you create layers of things that you could never dream of doing before, which can just save massive amounts of cost and can completely make redundant, very time-consuming and manual processes that you had in the past.
Yeah, I would just add that, if you think about it, without the standards, even if you got everyone to agree that they wanted to track the return on investment or the IRR for programs or whatever the right metrics are, without this standardization, it's still going to be tough to measure the effectiveness and how they're calculating it, right? Because they'll all be using different methods. We've got a couple of customers that have gone on record, state of Michigan, and they've advertised that they save over $1 million a day. That doesn't mean they're not spending that money back on the programs, but think about the effectiveness of a state saving $1 million a day and reinvesting that back into their programs. And it's through this investment in the technology to put it all together, set standards, and be able to share this information. So if I save $1 million in one department, I give it to another department, and they're effectively, better utilizing that cash and that investment. So they, in effect, are making, like you said, 15, 25% back on that investment. We've had other customers like AT&T who talked about, with our analytic platform, we've saved $1 billion over a 10-year period. $1 billion, and you ask them, were these big things? And they said no. It's little things. It was hundreds of thousands of little things that the frontline workers were able to see and solve or fix in a quick manner that allowed AT&T to use those advanced analytics, which get deployed across the way it's operationalized in all of their operations, to save them $1 billion. And again, that possibility is capable here for the federal government as well.
Thank you.
Using standardized data, it kind of will trickle down in lots of different places. It can help people who need services in a most comprehensive fashion. It can help administering agencies and reduce costs by being able to do that, determining eligibility cost effectively. It can help from administering services as efficiently as possible and evaluating programs in terms of true value. And I look forward to working with all of you to figure out how we can prove this and really have a paradigm shift. So talking about data and how we deliver services and embracing the power of the data that the government has is not innovation, but rather the norm in terms of how we do business.
Thank you. And just as a case in point, since I'm married to a Bronx girl, Mr. Dorr will get to have the
Oh, thank you very much. I'm from Brooklyn, but we love the Bronx in New York.
I won't ask you what baseball team you're
yeah. When the deputy mayor started the project with the mayor's endorsement, we had ROI on it all the way through it. When we were talking to our partners from the technology industries, we were very clear that we're going to make an investment here with your firm or this operation, but we want to see it return more so into the taxpayers and to our outcomes. The key benefit was time and energy. We are reducing costs of staff by sharing information. We believe that that's happening. You should also know that part of the return on investment that the city sees is the extent to which federal claiming sources are maximized. So there is a part of this that involves making sure that everybody who should be getting Medicaid or should be getting food stamps does, and that will lead to greater costs to the federal government.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all of your taking the time to come in and share from various parts of the country. It's been very helpful. I believe this may not be an issue that brings in crowds of people and emotional activists on either end of the spectrum, but I am admonished to the old baseball rule that pitching, baseball is a pretty easy game. It's just throwing and catching and hitting, and in business, it's these basic building blocks that will make the difference in the long run. And I believe that what we're all discussing here today is at the foundation of transforming our government in the 21st century to be something that all Americans can be proud of. If members have additional questions, they're going to submit them to you directly. What I would request is that you submit your answers back to the committee as well so that we can get them into the record so all have access to that. And with that, thank you again. Thank you to our guests and committee members. And with that, we stand adjourned.
I like your baseball analogy. That's good. No, you can make things too complicated sometimes, and it's about catching and hitting.
Which I could do